follow along and use this for reference. I will tell you, I threw up in the chat real quick, and thank you guys for posting. You guys just let me know like what your major is and where you're at in school right now, so that I can kind of get an idea of, you know, who the audience is for right now. And then please do, if anybody is applying this coming cycle in June, do hit me up and let me know in the chat if you're applying this cycle, or even if you are applying the current cycle too. But looks like there's a good mix of, I'm stoked to see Alexander, first year. Good on you for signing in, so you can get some advice up front early. But yeah, lots of people in their third and fourth year, which is pretty cool. Some people applying this cycle as well too. So this is going to be very informal. And I know Ms. Philman had said, like, keep yourselves on mute, but do use that chat, right? And so please, you know, as we're going along, interrupt me, ask some questions, and then there's going to be plenty of time for asking questions at the end. So as you guys keep throwing that in there too, looks like Ashley is applying this cycle. Hey, Ashley, are you applying this current cycle or this coming cycle? And then I'm going to share a screen with you guys so I can get a little presentation together, and then forgive me. Hopefully it comes up decently, but I always get how to do this one wrong in Zoom. So you let me know if this looks okay.
This looks great. I can see it clearly. So yeah.
Be like 0 for 10 on trying to get it to look good. So I'm going to give you guys a talk today on a really broad overview of what the entire cycle of, you know, applying to medical school looks like from beginning to end. And then, you know, ask questions as we go, and then definitely questions at the end. For some of you, this may be information that you already know. For some of you, it's new stuff. This is not any kind of promotional content, although I do work for an advising company. I'm not advertising for them. I do put the prospective doctor logo on all my slides because it's a free resource. And if you don't know about it, prospective doctor should be part of your daily routine. If you're a pre-med, your day probably looks like wake up, coffee, and then you're on like SDN or Reddit looking for stuff. Add prospective doctor on there because there's a lot of good resources on there. We'll hit some of those too. So we already kind of know a little bit about me. I'm not going to bother you with all the hats that I wear. I think the most important ones is that I'm a professional advisor. I've been on the admissions committee at University of California, Irvine for 4 years, also done residency admissions as well for family medicine. I'm a flight surgeon for the Army, which sounds really cool. We can talk about that if you're interested at the end. I'm a family physician. I work here in town, here in Colorado Springs, over by Palmer Park. And what else do I have for you? I think that's pretty much it. Yeah. So I did receive a scholarship through the Army. If you guys are interested in talking about scholarships for paying to medical school, we can definitely talk about that too. Okay, so I think this is a very depressing way to start off the topic, but look, 60% of applicants that apply to medical school don't get in. And so it's a pretty small minority that actually do get accepted. So I'm going to talk to you in broad strokes about how do you take yourself and pluck yourself from that 60% and put yourself into the 40% of people that do get accepted into medical school. These are very broad topics, and we'll kind of identify them in a little bit more specifics. But if all you leave today with is that you have to prepare this well in advance, well, that's the only thing that maybe you need to know for now. But you need to put together a thoughtful application. You must submit on time. And I'm going to probably say this like 10 times during this presentation, so don't get too annoyed. But I'm going to open my chat just so I don't miss anything too on here. But it is impossible to overestimate the importance of applying early. I think most of you know that medical school for most schools, right, is a rolling admission. But here's like a little bit of information that you don't get, is that some perspective on being actually on the admissions committee is that when we first jump into the admissions cycle, like in June, July, when stuff opens, we're all excited and ready to see like a new batch of applicants after having gone through the whole past year. And so I'm like excited to see everybody's application. I'm like, interview for this person, interview for that person. And then, you know, as it kind of wears on, the dean is like, hey, David, you got to slow down a little bit. We got a lot of applications to go through. And I start seeing how competitive the applicants are. And so I back off. And so applying early is just as much about rolling admissions as it is about taking advantage of kind of the enthusiasm of the admissions committee members too. I'm just going to make sure I'm keeping up with any questions that you guys ask as we go. Ashley's asking, about HPSP, let's definitely talk about that at the end. I do some work with the Army on advising for that too, but we can talk about other ways to pay for medical school as well. The application to medical school ensures both a primary application that goes out to every single school, as well as secondaries that are school specific. And then the last tip is interviewing like a pro. Many of you may have never even interviewed by the time that you actually get to an interview for medical school, never had like a job, a profession, anything like that. That's okay. But that means you got to practice. It's a skill. And so UCCS is a fantastic place to reach out for opportunities for like interview workshops, work with your pre-medical committee with Miss Philman about practicing for that stuff. It is invaluable resources, and I'm happy to help with workshops for that stuff too. So we're going to break down this whole cycle, and I'm really excited to give this conversation actually at the beginning of the year. But we're going to talk about going from January all the way through to the following year, the whole cycle, and we're going to identify these kind of brackets. And right now we're actually sitting in this initial bracket right here, which is roughly January through spring, and then all the way into summer as well too. We're going to dive into this a little bit deeper, but I think most importantly is that this early time at the beginning of the year should be, if you are applying this coming cycle, you should be prepping this cycle now. Tonight, you should be prepping your application if you're applying in June. If you're applying this cycle, by the way, and you haven't got any interviews or you're low on interviews, you should probably start thinking about plan B for applying again a second time this coming cycle in June, and you should be prepping your application. You got it tonight. And so part of that application in terms of preparation requires writing your personal statement, which is the most time intensive. A good personal statement, we'll talk about this more too, should take you about 2 to 3 months to write really well. Your work and activities section, which is a glorified resume for AMCAS, AA Commerce, or TMD SAS, wherever you're applying. That's pretty easy. You can get that done in about a week or so, just writing out your activities. Letters of recommendation. If you are applying to medical school, you should be doing that today. Please reach out to your letter writers today and ask them about that. You can never be too early about that stuff. But let's dive into some of the more specifics here too. Let's talk about that personal statement. So for most people, especially probably in Colorado, you're applying to MD schools, AMCAS, and you're applying to DO schools, AA Commerce. But some of you may be applying to TMD SAS. TMD SAS is like my enemy. It's a little bit complicated, but that's Texas schools if you're interested in it. The bottom line is that you probably shouldn't be applying to Texas schools unless you're from Texas, but that's a whole nother conversation. The nice thing about AMCAS and AA Commerce is now the personal statement is just 5,300 characters. It's pretty easy, so it's the same for both. Let me just change my chat function real quick. Perfect. Okay. So 5,300 characters. You never want to write that full 5,300 characters unless absolutely necessary, okay? Your goal is to get your point across in about a page and a paragraph. And that's completely subjective, but from reading through tons and tons of applications, that's kind of the sweet spot. A page ends up looking really short on AMCAS or AA Commerce, and then 5,300 characters. Like the first thing I do when I open an application on the admissions committee is I scroll down and look at how long that personal statement is just to see what I'm up against, because I got to read so many of these. So a page and a paragraph ends up being like 4,500 characters, and that's a pretty good spot. That should be your guide on your entire application. Is if you can do it in less characters, you should. Do not try to fill up the whole application. Precise writing will beat out volume or quantity every single time. You know, the personal statement I told you is going to take anywhere from 1 or a couple of months to write well. Start early so that you can go through lots and lots of revisions. Some people go through a couple revisions. I work with clients where we've done 20 revisions, and that takes a lot of time, right? Get it edited, whether you're using like a professional company, whether you're using your own resources at school, whether you're using friends, professors, just somebody objective needs to look at that. And you need somebody to tell you, look, your writing sucks. So you need somebody that can kind of give you that unbiased opinion and say, look, this is not good or this is good. Somebody that can give you that good feedback. Remember that it's going to be quality, not quantity, so don't fill it up. And then that's as much as I want to say about personal statement for now. We can definitely do deep dives into this, through UCCS if we want to talk about like workshops and stuff like that. But let's keep moving just to get an idea of this whole process. So that first block of time is mainly preparation. We talked about personal statement, work and activities, letters of recommendation. The only other piece to kind of prep that primary application is talking with your school about transcripts. You should learn how your transcript system works. Your registrar takes care of that stuff. Just get an idea of like what the process is like. You can't start that till May when AMCAS and AA Commerce opens, but you don't want to wait till then to find out how the whole process works. So if there's forms, if there's fees, is it online? Is it paper application? Do you have to schedule an appointment? Find that out now so that you don't have to learn about it in May, June when you submit it. So once you get your primary application in, you're going to click go. It's going to get processed or verified. That takes about a week or two. The sooner you submit your application, the quicker it gets verified, the sooner you'll be on to the next part of your application, which is the dreaded secondaries. So secondaries are school specific. They can be anywhere from a couple of questions to John Hopkins now has a 7-page secondary. It's my least favorite secondary. So you need to be prepped in advance. Is that most people are pretty darn good about prepping their primary application and they submit it on time. And then, now you got like a stack of secondaries. I literally did have a stack. That makes me sound old, but I got them in paper format when I was applying and there was like a big stack on my desk. It was really stressful. But nowadays, when you submit, it's all digital. And so the second you get verified, boom, your email's just going to fill up with like 10, 15 secondaries all at a time. There's no reason why you can't prepare these in advance. And so this is why I throw up the prospective doctor slide, is that there's something on there called PDR Tools. It's got a secondary database. You can find every single secondary over the past 5 years for every MD school. I think they got some DO schools on there too. Most schools don't change these every year. Sometimes they do. But if you're like me, so how I prepared my application, I had my secondaries done before I even got my first one. So primary application opens up June 1st, June 5th, whatever it's going to be this year. Boom, you click go because your primary is already done. You get secondaries, you get them, you copy, paste into the system, click go, move on, you're ready for review for an interview. So you could potentially have interviews in August, September and be ahead of the game on that rolling admissions if you prepare everything in advance. And remember I said, I cannot overestimate the importance of that early application, right? So prep these in advance, and I'll show you what some of these secondaries look like if you haven't seen them already. They're going to be, these are common questions. I'm not going to read them for you. You can kind of take a look. You're going to see these at almost every single school. Some people will hit me up and say, well, what if a school changes its secondary? Then I wasted my precious time. The answer is no. Maybe that one school changed their question, but I guarantee that question will be on another secondary. So it's not time wasted. By the time you've filled out anywhere between 5 to 10 secondaries, you've probably seen every single question on all of the secondaries. So you can piece them around and mix and match and build your secondaries a lot quicker. Now, you never ever want to copy and paste one question directly over to it. Don't sacrifice time just to kind of get it going quickly, or don't sacrifice quality for time there, because how you answer the same question for one school may be different for another, judging by the secondary questions above and below it. So you don't want to be redundant. And we can talk about that more in detail in another session, but hopefully that makes a little sense. I highlighted on here one of my favorite questions on secondaries because it's a really important one that demands some time. The secondaries, although they're not as time intensive per school as your primary application, every question is very, very important. And even one question can make or break your application. So spend the same time and energy you spent on your primary, putting this thing together, getting it edited, getting it reviewed, taking your time to look up, specific information for each school. Okay, I'm talking really fast. So let me pause there for a little bit before I talk about Casper. And let me know, guys, do you have any questions in the chat function while I get a sip of this drink as well too? Someone asked, should your secondary application be personal to the school you're applying to? The answer is absolutely, and very carefully. You want to spend about 15 to 20 minutes researching the school before you start that secondary, because they're going to always ask why our school, and you want to make sure that you're answering that question very specifically. I actually wrote, there's a blog on prospective doctor that I wrote about how to write the perfect response to that very question. So if you just Google that one, you can find it as well too. We'll share these resources with you guys as well. But yes, it must be personal. That's why you can't copy paste from school to school, because it looks sloppy. And it's really easy because you got to remember, admissions committee used to be you guys. We filled out those secondaries. And so it's very easy for us to spot when you're just kind of copy pasting back and forth. Great question. What else? Anybody else got any question out there? Otherwise, we'll jump into Casper and now Altus Suite. All right, we'll keep cruising, but please keep the questions coming in the chat function. So Casper, I would not know what it stands for, but I did put it on this slide so you can know what it stands for. This didn't exist when I was applying. It's supposed to be a personal touch from the admissions committee. I kind of find it a pain in the butt, to be honest. Just an extra hoop that you got to jump through for applying to medical school. The short of it is it's a computer-based test. You do not need to study for this like you studied for the MCAT. Usually I recommend just go on the website, peruse the website, become familiar with it, check out some YouTube videos on it. It's supposed to test like ethical decision making and stuff like that. Now Casper has become part of this larger suite of exams called Altus Suite. There's a couple more on there. The bottom line is that you want to complete that whole Altus Suite because more and more schools are using it. Almost every school requires Casper right now, and more are adopting the other little pieces of that test. So go check out Altus Suite, check out Casper, get familiar with it. And you want to do this. This is part of your secondary application technically. So it's part of your review to get an interview. I think practically you want to get this done sometime around June, July. Basically, as soon as you finish that primary, you can take a breath of fresh air, go out, celebrate for a night, and then right back to prepping for secondaries and getting your Casper and Altus Suite stuff done. Like I said, preparation for Casper is not like preparation for the MCAT. I think there are formal courses you can take on it. Med School Coach offers like formal training for it. I don't think that's absolutely necessary. I think, just look up some YouTube videos, check out the website. I think that's perfectly fine to prep for this. Okay, so we got, I do want to circle back because I mentioned the MCAT and realized I kind of left out the most important part of applying to medical school is the MCAT. Let's go back on and touch on that real quick. I think the biggest question I get asked is, when should I take the MCAT, or how late should I take the MCAT? The answer is the earlier the better. I set a cutoff period of February. If you're going to apply in June, so let's say you're going to apply this coming June, you shouldn't take your MCAT later than February. And here's the reason why. You prep, let's say you spent 3 to 6 months prepping for your MCAT. You take your MCAT in February and, God forbid, you bomb the test, right? You get a horrible score. That at least gives you some leeway there, is that if you bomb it, so you take the test in February, you get your score back in March, you've got April and May to study, take it again in June, and you're still ready to go by July. It's not perfect, but it gives you some leeway. Compare that to what most people do, and they take their MCAT in May. If you take your MCAT in May, your score is back in June. You can still apply early, right? As early as possible. But if you bomb the test, I'm sorry, you're stuck with that score and you're going to have to apply with it. And if you don't want to apply with a bad MCAT score, about 90% of your ability to get into medical school is GPA and MCAT, unfortunately. So if you don't have the scores to do it, you shouldn't bother applying anyways. It would be better to wait a whole nother cycle, but you don't want to do that if you don't have to. So try to take your test in January and February. That's easy advice for you people that aren't applying right now, or at least have a little bit of lead up time, like our first year that joined us. Plan ahead, my friend. But if you can, try to push that test back as far as possible. And then, if you guys have questions about, well, shoot, I got a bad score, what do I do? Happy to help kind of set up some workshops, and we can talk about planning for worst case scenarios and stuff. But let's get back to our whole process here. We did our primary, we got our letters of recommendation, we got our secondaries done. Now it's on for interviews. During the period between finishing your secondaries and getting into medical school, you basically have 2 things you can do. You can send letters and you can interview, and you can also twiddle your thumbs and just wait around. I want you to remember this about sending update letters. I don't really care about the difference between update letter, letter of interest, letter of intent. Schools don't care about the title of your letter or exactly, they care about the content in it. Use a letter for any time you get stuck. If you submit your primary and you get on hold for a secondary, send a letter. Send a letter of interest. Just tell the school that you're interested in them or any kind of update that you've been doing. If you send your secondary and you get waitlisted for an interview, send a letter. If you get interviewed and you get waitlisted, send a letter. Okay. So you can send those as often as you want, but only when you're stuck. Don't just send a letter in the middle of nowhere, because you want to make sure that you're using these for a specific reason. So if you just decide to send a letter out of nowhere and then you get stuck, then you're going to bore them by sending another letter and you're just going to end up being redundant. So remember that. Okay. Interviews. I think what's really exciting is that if you have an interview or you're looking forward to an interview, you got to understand that at this point, the school deems you an acceptable matriculant. You have all the qualities to enter their medical school. They just want to know what you're like, right? Everything on paper says that you're going to do well on medical school. So think of it more like almost like a first date than a job interview, is that you're already qualified. They just want to know what you're like. What's your personality like? How do you handle stress? What are you interested in? What are your goals, your passions? What do you want to accomplish with medicine? These are the things that you're going to want to highlight and focus. And again, you cannot over prepare for an interview. It's really important. You can access interview, techniques, questions, all on Prospective Doctor. There's tons of resources there. Practice the interview questions, write them out so you can kind of distill your thoughts, but make sure you're rehearsing this in person. If you got no friends, that's okay. You're a pre-med. You're probably stuck with your nose in your book like I was as a college student. Just videotape yourself so you can at least see what you look like. At least you need some kind of tactile feedback like that. Okay, so I'm going to end it here so we have plenty of time for questions. But that's kind of a very fast talking 25-minute kind of overview, 30,000-foot view of the whole application process right there. We talked about at least some timelines, what you need to do, how to put it together, why it's important. So I think this is mostly just an introduction to kind of give you guys an idea what's going on. I'm going to pull these slides off here and let me pull up my chat again too. And let's see if we can take some questions. Feel free, if you guys are comfortable, keeping in mind it's a recorded session too. Like, you guys can unmute yourself and ask some questions too. And you as well, Ms. Philman, if you have any questions you want to ask on behalf, happy to field them. I know that was a very quick talk. Let me scroll up to see if anybody else was asked any questions. We got one. For cadets, should we treat the LOA, that's a letter of acceptance, from our commanding officer like a letter of recommendation? Okay, maybe that's not a letter of acceptance. LOA, some other kind of letter of approval. Thank you for helping me with that. Like, treat it as a recommendation or start asking for other ones. Great question. You want to have, let's talk about letters of recommendation. You need 3 absolutely, please no more than 5, okay? 3 letters that you need are 2 science professors and 1 non-science professor. That's going to get you into like 99% of the schools without any questions. So whether you're a cadet, whether you're a year out of school, if you're maybe 3-4 years out of school, then maybe these letters don't correspond to you, and that's a personal question that we can kind of field later. You want to get those 2 science letters and 1 non-science letter, and then anything extra. So if you're a cadet, go get a letter from your commanding officer or somebody in there. If you got a job, go get a letter from your boss, work study, whatever, a physician, anything extra on that. 5 is a good cutoff. Most schools don't let you upload more than 5, and most admissions committee officers aren't going to read more than 5 anyways. So you got to imagine by the time the reader gets to your letters of recommendation, I just read your entire primary, including your work and activities, your personal statement, your secondary, and now I got to read like all your letters of recommendation. So you want to make sure that you only have the ones that are important. 2 science, 1 non-science gets you in the door, and then anything extra on top of that is helpful. If you are applying to DO schools, almost every single school requires a physician letter. It doesn't have to be a DO. It would be better if you did, but getting a physician letter is important for that too. Great question. Anybody else? Why is it not a good idea to apply to medical schools in Texas unless you're from Texas? Great question. I am going to cheat by pulling up, I think I have, never mind, I don't have it open. That's okay. I can tell you that Texas schools prefer Texas residents. Most Texas schools take less than 10% out of state, which means it's low yield. The other thing about Texas too is that they're pretty difficult schools. They're competitive schools. So it's not like you can just toss your hat in the ring for Texas schools. The schools that are more open to people outside Texas are the very competitive ones. Think like Baylor. These are at the top of the list. They're almost as competitive as like Yale and Harvard, okay? So to go through the whole process of opening up TMD SAS, it's a totally different application system with a totally different timeline. Their Texas handbook is like 200 pages. I have to read it every year and I never understand it. So you have to go through all that process just to access a couple schools. It's relatively low yield. Unless you're like, I must go to this school. And actually some schools, I may be even wrong, like Baylor may actually participate with AMCAS. I think a couple of them do. But unless you're dead set on like, I must go to Texas or you're from Texas, it's not worth doing that because you can get enough schools between AMCAS and AA Commerce. Just don't recommend it. Another question. Oh, thank you guys. Lots of good questions coming through. Is the process for DO med school applications different than MD schools? It's becoming increasingly similar over the years. I think the biggest change was last year when the personal statements coincided with 5,300 characters. Just makes it simpler. The best way to, apply to MD and DO schools, and I'm going to tell you why, because Alexander asked a good question after this about GPA. We'll talk about GPA and MCAT, so why you should apply to DO schools. It's super easy. Do your AMCAS first, and then it takes maybe a week to transcribe that over to ACOMS. The personal statement's going to be the same character count. The only thing you got to do is talk about osteopathic medicine. So that's pretty easy. The work and activity section, instead of 700 characters, it's 600 characters. And instead of 3 most meaningful activities in AMCAS, there's none. So you just got to remove it. So you just got to trim that down. And then same letters of recommendation, all that stuff, super simple. So it's a pretty straightforward application process. Easier to start with AMCAS and trim it down into AACOMAS versus vice versa. And then I will use that as a springboard for Alexander's question of what range of GPA is looked for when looking at your applicants. So the average matriculant GPA for MD schools is 3.7. The average MCAT for MD schools is 511, okay? If you have a 511 3.7, which is the average MD matriculant, that is a cutting off point for me to say you should apply backup DO. Now, I will tell you that there's a big discussion on the internet about DO versus MD. The only place that whole conversation exists is online pre-med forums. In the real world, nobody cares about the difference between the 2 letters behind your name. Not in medical school, not in residency, not as a practicing physician. Your patients call you doctor, and that's all that they care about. So it doesn't matter for residency applications, and that's my bread and butter. It doesn't matter for getting a job. The only thing that matters is your performance in medical school. So that is a easy way of thinking. You should definitely be thinking about DO schools. Apply maybe 10 to 15 backup schools if you're at 511 3.7 or lower. If you're above that, like 513, 3.8, you could probably get away with it. Although I'm pretty darn conservative. I usually recommend applying to backup DO schools. Why not? The average GPA for DO schools is about 3.6. The average MCAT is 504. And so if you're sitting at like a 510, you don't have a very good chance of getting into an MD school, but you're a competitive applicant for DO. You'll have your pick of the litter. So it's very, very good idea to consider DO. And I'm going to ask you all a question that you don't have to answer for yourselves now, but think about this, is that let's suppose whatever your scores, you apply to MD and DO schools. The whole cycle goes through and you get rejected from every single MD school, but you get a DO acceptance. Will you decide to matriculate and take that DO acceptance and go to medical school? Or would you reject the DO acceptance, retake the MCAT, take a post-bac or a master's course, and then apply to MD schools later? If your answer is, I think I might take that DO acceptance, you need to apply to DO schools. You definitely should. If your answer is absolutely not, I will never touch a DO school with a 10-foot pole, then don't bother applying despite all the advice I gave you, because it's a waste of time. If you're not going to go, then don't. But think very hard on that question. This film, and we should definitely do like a whole presentation about DO schools as well too, because I think a lot of people don't know that much about them. But Thank you for those questions. I got a little carried away on that one. That was a good one, but hopefully it gives you tons of information. Let me catch up with some of these too. What do you suggest is the best way to study for the MCAT? Self-study, prep course? Haven't started yet. Plan on taking it in April. Hopefully that sounds viable. I think it definitely does sound viable. It's not the best case scenario, right? That February timeline's a little bit better, but play it by ear, right? If you take it in April and you do well, then remember, you should have already had your application started when? Tonight, right? And so whether you take the MCAT in April and do well or not, you should already have your primary application complete by April anyways. So if you do well, go ahead and apply. If you don't, hold your application, consider maybe applying next year, I think, depending on what your score is on the retake. But how to study for it? I think you just got to be honest with yourself. Most people nowadays need a prep course. I took a prep course. I don't have any recommendations about one is better than the other. It's the structure that matters. And so whether you take Kaplan or Princeton Review or Med School Coach has one too, I think the important thing is that you gauge yourself honestly and use some kind of structure. I think the structure is important. If you want to wing it, you could try to wing it and do it on your own. You just have to be honest. And the way to keep yourself honest is practice tests. Take consistent full-length practice tests and use your studying and your tests as a benchmark. If you're self-studying and your testing is going up, keep doing it. By all means, keep going. If you're self-studying and your score isn't budging, you need to say, look, I got to throw in the towel and I got to take a prep course. So which one you take, not as important as whether or not you take one to begin with. Okay, somebody asked particular personal statement tips. Start with a narrative, finish with motivation, medical education. I will tell you some broad strokes for right now, and then we should definitely do like a formal workshop for this. And hopefully, if we ever get the chance, I'd love to come meet you guys in person, kind of do like some breakout sessions and actually do some writing too. But I'll tell you, here's your personal statement tips for today in broad strokes. 5-paragraph format, just like you learned in English 101. Introduction. Your introduction serves to draw the reader in. Most people benefit from a narrative type voice. So like bring me in, tell me a story to get my attention. And then the introduction should end with some kind of introduction of the theme or the themes of the rest of your paragraph. That is the only place that you should use storytelling, anecdotes, or a narrative voice. The rest of the essay should be all content. Body paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 should be expanding on the themes that you introduced in your introduction. Try to pick 2 examples per paragraph for your themes. And why 2? Most people end up writing paragraphs that look like this. I did blah, 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 blah. And then the last sentence is, and this is what I learned. When I see that, I start skipping to the bottom of every paragraph because I don't care about the story. I just want to care about what you learned about. So pick 2 experiences and try to weave them in. So let's say your theme is I'm culturally competent. Pick 2 examples that demonstrate that. Don't tell me stories about being culturally competent. Use examples. They can be as simple as like a 1-line sentence about, okay, like personally, I worked as a teacher in Southeast Asia. So I'm just basically introduced. I was a mathematics teacher in Southeast Asia for a year. And then I go into what I learned from that. That's the opposite of the whole story with a little reflection. 1 example is not enough. 3 examples tends to come off like a list in a paragraph. So 2 is the sweet spot. Your conclusion basically wraps up the whole essay and ties your themes together and should end with a bang. What I mean by end with a bang is that if a good introduction serves to draw the reader in, a good conclusion leaves the reader with something to remember you by. This is a little bit difficult to coach, but the best way I can cue you is that don't end it objectively. Don't end it with, and these are the following reasons for which I shall be a great doctor and I want to come to medical school. Think more of passion about what you want to accomplish. Think of like, I think a passionate approach, emotional approach is the best way to kind of end that personal statement. So there you have it. That was like a 2-minute crash course on personal statement. We should definitely talk more about that, but hopefully it gives you at least some rough structure. I wrote a blog on that, by the way. It's all on Prospective Doctors, so just go check out free resources like that. You can find more of that stuff too. I did a podcast on it too. Okay, what are admissions committees looking for in your personal statement? By the way, Ms. Philman, how much more time do we have?
Sorry. We end at 12:30.
12:30. Okay, this is totally fine to take more questions.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for all posting these, guys. So next question is, what are admissions committees looking for in your personal statement? I think I talked about how to write it. So that was like the structure of it. So what is the content that they're looking for? I think in short is that I think most people, especially this was me when I was writing my personal statement, you kind of feel like you need some gimmick, like something new. Like you have to prove to them something new. Like, well, I didn't go save babies in Africa. Like, how am I going to get into medical school? I didn't do anything cool. And I think you got to remember is that everybody goes into medicine for the same two reasons. We want to help people and we like medicine. And you just got to find a way to say that in a unique way, but not a new way. Okay. It's got to be unique to you. So I think the best way, so this is how I cue my clients for it, is that I don't want to hear about your resume. Okay. Please don't tell me your resume. That's what your work and activities section should be like. By the way, always write your work and activities section first. It's a good instructive way to get out everything that you want to talk about your resume so that it doesn't appear on your personal statement. Personal statement should be about you. And so I want to hear things like, what are you passionate about? What do you hope to accomplish in medicine? What do you think you can bring to medicine? Do you have a unique way of seeing things? Do you have a unique perspective? Think about your upbringing, your background, your educational background. Maybe you're an English major instead of biology major, an engineer. Maybe you can bring something new to the picture. So it doesn't have to be new as in something that nobody's ever said before. It just has to be personal to you. That can take some time, which is why I said like a good personal statement takes several months, right? Those questions should take some time to think about. But the nice way of, getting at your personal statement is that 5-paragraph approach. You break it up into pieces because remember, you all are starting your application tonight, right? And so go ahead and just write an intro tonight. Just write a body paragraph. You can break it into manageable size pieces because when you sit down and you open Microsoft Word and you just sit there with a blank page and you're like, okay, write my personal statement. It's pretty difficult to do, but just start with, let me write an introduction. Let me capture like the reader's attention with a story about myself. Just start there. And then if you break it into pieces, then it becomes a lot more manageable. Okay, we got some more stuff on here. Lots of personal statement stuff, which is good. What is your advice on discussing sensitive topics in a personal statement? This is a really good question. There are a lot of sensitive things that may be beneficial for your application and may be harmful for your medication. Did I say medication? Your application. Sorry, I'm still in clinical mode. I think here's some broad strokes of sensitive stuff. Let's talk about personal issues like a breakup, a death in the family, a mental illness, a physical illness, something like that. These can be sensitive topics that may be very relevant to your pursuit of medicine, just need to be carefully discussed. I think those are all fine to bring up in your personal statement. Here's what I'll tell you. Number one, mental health problems are extremely common and they're very powerful motivators to get into medicine to begin with. Number one, I'm a family physician. And so, part of my practice, actually most of my practice is about behavioral health and dispelling the stigma of mental health. That's important to recognize that most doctors feel that way, but we don't know that, especially there's a lot of old white men in medicine, and you have to deal with them, right? They may not see mental health the same way as somebody like me that's in the trenches with it. Best way to tackle mental health, stress, anxiety, stuff like that, it's a diagnosis, it's a medical problem. Talk about it in strokes of a medical problem. Every doctor can get behind that and understand that. And that is both accurate and truthful and gets your message across. So instead of talking about mental health, talk about just a medical problem, okay? That may seem kind of like slighted, like I'm trying to get you to avoid it. And I am, because I have to be sensitive to the fact that not everybody is sensitive, right? And so in the hands of the wrong reader, that could mess with your application. So I want you to be both honest and looking out for your best interests. That goes the same with like a lot of people talk about, like an emotional breakup event, which has this very formative impact on your life. The same thing is people may not understand that. So you may just talk about the general broad strokes of emotional struggle without getting into the specifics. Now, you do have to be prepared with, even if you stay general in the personal statement, You're probably going to have to discuss that in the interview. So don't put anything in your personal statement that you're not comfortable talking about in an interview, because somebody's probably going to ask about that later. Other sensitive topics, I will tell you there's 2 topics that you need to leave out of your personal statement. And for those same reasons that we don't understand the reader. Number 1, politics. Number 2 is religion, which are very powerful motivators for some people, certainly the religious aspect. I want people to be proud of their religion and also separate it from their personal statement. Many people's religious experience play important roles in their motivation in medicine and in their practice of medicine. But you have to be sensitive that you can do that once you get into medical school and into practice. But we have to get through that threshold of admissions first. If you are, a religious person and the person reading your essay is not, and they have a particular bad experience with religion, that could cancel your chances of admission just based on that. So try to keep that stuff out of it until you get through the doors, and then feel free to kind of let it all out at then. But there's an important part about, just at least getting through the doors and making sure you don't rub somebody the wrong way. Okay, sorry, still talking very fast, but want to get through some of these. Hopefully this stuff is helpful for you guys. Okay, MCAT strategy. Session with Princeton Review is April 12th. Email me to register. That sounds fantastic. Oh, that's from you, Sarah. Thank you. So yes, I like that planning for MCAT stuff too, and happy to. I'm not a pro on the MCAT. I did okay to get in, but I'm not a pro at like how to actually manage some of that stuff. But happy to talk about timeline stuff for that. Okay, when and where will the recording be available? I bet Ms. Philman has answered that one. Yes, okay. Would community college credits count against you when applying to medical school? Absolutely not. And so anybody out there even considering community college, do it. Fantastic. Take the cheapest route towards your education, please. You're going to have a lot of debt to pay off. Admissions do not care if you got your prerequisites from a community college or Harvard or Yale. It doesn't matter. Just get them done. Nowadays, too, it doesn't matter if you do it online or in person, okay? COVID exists. Nobody's going to discount you for taking biochem online versus in person. That's going to change when stuff gets back to normal. But for now, feel empowered to do that online, community college, wherever you got to do it. Don't try to get some name brand on that stuff. Okay, I think last question. Well, we still got some time too. One question is, how do you ask for a letter of recommendation if you're not BFFs with your professor? I love that question. I can definitely relate to that. How many do we need? No more than 5, definitely 3, right? 2 science, 1 non-science. Could you briefly discuss how COVID has influenced admission requirements? Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about asking for letters of recommendation. You don't have to be BFFs with your professor, but you should know them and they should at least know who you are. So here's the best way to do it. Start a class. 2 weeks later, go meet with them for office hours, and then start to make the office hours a regular thing so you can see them every couple of weeks or once a week or whatever. Just get some face time with the professor, okay? Once you've got some rapport with the person, they know who you are, and when you show up, they're not who are you, then you can go ahead and tell them, hey, I'm interested in applying to medical school. Would you be interested in writing me a letter of recommendation? And the answer is they're all thrilled about it, okay? Because I can tell you as a letter writer, it doesn't matter how many times I get asked, it's still a compliment to be asked for a letter of recommendation. So don't feel like you're like putting them off or anything. The other thing too is most professors have a template for this, okay? They've already written letters of recommendation. It's super easy to do. And so they just open their template and they put your name in there. And that's okay, is that 99% of professor letters look like that. It looks like 3/4 of the page is like, my name is Dr. So-and-so, and I study this, and I love to do this, and I do this. And then at the bottom is like, Jimmy showed up for class and asked some good questions. That's not the best letter of recommendation, but it's not harmful in any way. That's just part and parcel of kind of getting a letter from a professor. So don't feel like that's going to do something bad for you. If you put in the time and they know who you are, they're not going to throw you under the bus, and they'll write you a decent letter that has that. The more time you put into the relationship, the more that 3/4 page of them starts to become more and more about you. And that is definitely to your advantage. But even if you get that standard letter, look, what's important is that you got the 2 science and 1 non-science to get you in the door. And that way you can move forward with your application. Let's talk about COVID influencing admissions decisions. Number 1, timeline seems to be way, way backed up. I've got one applicant right now. She's got a 523 on her MCAT and a 4.0 from Cornell with 1 interview. If that sounds scary, it kind of is. the timeline is just super backed up right now. Normally that applicant probably would have had several interviews in the fall, and now they're starting to come through in like late winter. But I think it's important to understand the application goes all the way till May, even June of the following year. So more to come on that. But over at least the past 2 years that I've been working with clients during COVID, that application process is backed up, which means, again, the earlier you're in there, the more you can overcome that, because you don't want to get stuck at the backload. I think that backload is probably to do with students. Students are having a harder time getting experiences, taking their MCAT because stuff gets shut down. People have to fly all over the country to get an MCAT done. So they're applying later. So admissions just have to work slower because they have to give people more time to have their application complete. So if you can be one of those people that have everything ready to go up front, it's definitely to your advantage. The other thing is you're going to do most stuff, like all of life seems to be on Zoom. You're going to do your Zoom interviews for most schools. You may do some stuff in person, but you're going to do that through Zoom. Some people do like Zoom recordings for some secondary questions, some of that stuff. But most of it is pretty standard operating procedure. Just everything's pushed to the right a little bit. Okay. Ooh, good question about, will you be able to read your letter of recommendation before the letter is submitted? You can, and you never should. The reason is that the intent of a letter of recommendation is it is a confidential communication between the letter writer and the school. If you can see it, it's all of a sudden subject to your own interpretation. Because if you look at every single letter of recommendation, then you could cherry pick the good ones and kick out the bad ones. The less you know, the more authentic the letters become. And on AMCAS, you're going to have to check a box that says, I did not look at my letter of recommendation. If you did look, then you can't honestly check that box. And I want you to be able to check that box. This comes into play because a lot of professors, you'll be like, hey, can you write a letter of recommendation? They're like, absolutely. Why don't you put it on my desk and I'll sign it? You should gently try to encourage them to write their own letter. I will send some resources to Ms. Philman too. There's a great template that AMCAS has, because the reason people do that usually is those are relatively newer letter writers and they don't know how to do it. So if you can be like, well, here's exactly how to write the letter, then okay, they'll do it themselves. The other thing you can do to help avoid that, give them a personal statement. Give them a personal statement, like a draft at least, so that they know a ton about you, more than you could tell them in any sit-down meeting with like a, office hours. So if they've got the AMCAS instructions, how to write a good letter, plus your personal statement, they got a ton of stuff to work with to actually write their own letter. And then you don't have to be the one that writes your own letter. Great question. That can be damaging for some people. Any other questions? We got about 10 minutes left. Thank you guys for joining me. This was pretty fun. I like to do the question stuff. More fun than the presentations. You guys probably have to sit through a lot of Zoom presentations these days.
I'll pop in. I don't see any questions coming in, but I get this question a lot from students about shadowing. It's been very hard to attain for a lot of students. What are admission committees thinking about shadowing hours?
Yeah, shadowing. So that's definitely a change with COVID, right? Is that, okay, so it's not waived, right? And I think what's important is that, and we'll talk a little bit about this as well too. So there's 5 pieces of your application. 2 of them are numbers. Those are 2 separate ones, GPA and MCAT. And then you've got community service, research, leadership, clinical experience, and shadowing. Clinical experience and shadowing are different. Clinical experience is so that you understand how the healthcare system works. That can be shadowing in an ER. It could be an office assistant. You just need to see how medicine works. The shadowing is specifically so you can understand the doctor-patient relationship. That's you one-on-one with the doctor and a patient. That's pretty impossible to get right now. Hospitals don't let you in for volunteer work, and doctors' offices aren't letting people in too. I will put this out there tentatively. I may be able to accommodate some students in my own clinic, but I don't want to just throw that out there because I'll get deluged with a ton of applicants all at once. I will definitely circle back with you, Ms. Philman, about that to see if maybe I can open up some opportunities, because I have a very small office and we can arrange some policies for that maybe. But I think you can cold call people. You can just get on Google and look up doctors' offices and cold call people. You will not have much success with that. Normally, I tell people, go put on some professional attire, and bring your personal statement and go to an office in person. It's really hard to turn down like a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, professionally dressed pre-med student with a personal statement. It's really easy to do that over the phone or via email. But show up in person, it's another story. That's kind of difficult now with masks and COVID, and some people won't let you in. And so that might be a bust. You can certainly try, though. There's no harm in that. And that's a good option for you. There's also digital shadowing, online shadowing. I'll be honest with you, I don't like this. I think it's a ploy taking advantage of pre-meds, honestly, to make them pay to like give lectures and call that shadowing. I don't think it accomplishes the goal. You can do it, and I don't think it's absolutely wrong. I don't particularly like the business practice of it. You can do it, and you can put that on your application. I think the bottom line to recognize is that everybody's deficient in this, and if you have a great application, you're not going to get rejected solely based on that. If you make sure to show the admissions committee that you tried. So that might be put in your work and activities section, might be put in your personal statement. You need to show them, I tried to get shadowing, but I just couldn't swing it. Because that's totally different than the person that just doesn't have it on their application. Great question, though. Couple more here. What are experiences to have that will help with your application and that look enticing to those who read them? So there's those 5 ones, right? And you have to have all 5 if you can. Certainly shadowing is difficult to get. I think goal number 1 is have all 5. The first thing I do when I open an application is I just scroll through their work and activities and kind of just count on my hands, make sure you've got them all. If you've got them all, there's no holes. If you don't have them all, depending on the school, I might just toss your application right away, because there's plenty of applicants that are not deficient. Like if there's no volunteering, I'm going to be like, nah, there's people that have volunteering. This guy's out. And so make sure you have them all so you can pass the whole test and kind of get through and make sure there's no gaps. After that, I think this is really important, and I'm glad you asked this question, is that I don't care how many of them you have, and I much more care how much time you've put into it and how you can reflect on it. So I'd rather see somebody that worked in a homeless shelter for 4 years, just like little bits at a time, like an hour a week, rather than somebody that worked at like several different volunteer things for a little bit. Don't focus on collecting activities so much as, getting yourself involved in them. It's useful for 2 things. Number 1, I think it's helpful not to spend your pre-medical life just trying to check boxes. Try to find something that you enjoy and you're passionate about that also will help you with your application, which is pretty much anything. So find something that you like to do that's good for your community. Do that, invest in it. I think that's helpful as a sustainability item. And then number 2 is that the longer you're involved in something, the more you can grow in it. And so it naturally gives you some leadership experience. Otherwise, trying to get a discrete leadership position, like president of a club or treasurer or something like that, 1, it's not as meaningful, and it kind of is a little bit harder to do. Much better to just involve yourself in anything. Become a TA and grow in it. Teach new TAs. Get in a research lab and do your research. Teach the new people that come in. Expand it and grow in that role. Whatever you're in, there's a good saying in the Army that says, bloom wherever you're planted. So whatever you got, grow in it. And that will be much more important than trying to collect a bunch of different things. Okay. How do you recommend getting those volunteer hours in for a busy student who also works? Great question. There's always time to get something, okay? Even if it's an hour a week, an hour a month, just get involved in it, because number 1, even if you did 1 hour a month, you can put it on your application so you'll pass that gap test, right? So make sure that you at least get your foot in the door. And then 2, don't discount the amount of time you can do over a long period of time. Even if you started the activity the day you submitted your application, well, remember the application's a whole year. Even halfway through the application, you've got 6 months worth of experience in that, even if you just do a little bit of it. And we understand, look, if your application shows me you're working, look, I got it. You don't have time to do other stuff. So, go ahead and do what you can. If you're absolutely strapped for cash and you're just working all your free time, no worries. Please still apply. Of course, you're going to take some time in your personal statement to identify what you were doing and why you didn't have the time to do other stuff. We get that. And sorry, again, those 5 things, and I'll send this out too, but you can find them on Prospective Doctor as well too. Those 5 items, they're just drop down items in AMCAS. as community service, leadership, research, shadowing, clinical experience. Is research required for every application? Not for everything, but best to have it on there. You should be, most AdComs want you to be at least familiar with the application of the scientific process. Now, can you get into Alabama College of Osteopathic Medicine without research? Most definitely. Can you get into Johns Hopkins with no research? No way. So better to have it and not need it, but definitely try to get yourself involved. You don't have to love it. I did OChem research when I was in college, and kind of liked it. Definitely didn't love it, but try to at least get your hand in it. You don't have to love it. You don't have to do it forever, but just try it. Would the position of a store manager at a retail store be taken seriously for the leadership section? You bet it would. It all depends on how you write about it, right? And so if you wrote on there store manager, and then you focus on like, our store sells the most lovely dog leashes in the world, and you just talk about like all the stuff your store does, oh, it's a missed opportunity. You could be the store, you could be the manager at McDonald's. I don't care. Just reflect on it. And that's what most applicants are missing. So tell us what you did about a little bit of that stuff, but spend the bulk of it talking about what you learned from it, because there's tons of lessons to be learned in any leadership position. So yeah, you can absolutely use it. It's all about the narrative and how you write that. And with that, I think we hit our time limit.
Yes, we are at the end of our time, but thank you so much for joining us. I know this is such valuable information for students. If you have any questions, if you are interested in learning more, you want to hear more about potentially shadowing with Dr. Flick, or any of the things that we're offering for spring 2022, please email me. It's sfillman@uccs.edu. And we have a lot of great resources in our office as well. But thank you so much for joining us, and we will be in touch to provide more resources for you students.
Thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Ms. Fillman, for having me, and hope to see you guys in the near future too.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.